Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Sound familiar to everybody? This is the first section of our 13th Amendment. Today I want to spend a few moments talking about this famous amendment. I want to discuss the events that led up to it, the challenges that it faced, and what the amendment meant. There were several key events that happened before the signing of the amendment, but let's start at the beginning. The Civil War. When the American Civil War began in 1861, President Lincoln carefully crafted the conflict as concerning the preservation of the Union, rather than the attempt to abolish slavery. In fact, according to the National Constitution Center, when he first became president, Lincoln supported a 13th Amendment that would in fact protect slavery in the states that had already existed. This original amendment, which is on display at the American Archives and was reported on by the Washington Post, read, "No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will abolish or interfere with any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state." Luckily, this amendment was never passed. And as the course of the war went on, Lincoln's thinking changed. He was convinced that the abolishing of slavery had become a sound military strategy and was morally the correct path. So on September 22nd, after a Northern victory, Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, and it declared, as of January 1st, 1863, all slaves shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. Unfortunately, the Emancipation Proclamation on its own could not free any slaves. That would take an act of Congress. There's going to be several challenges to get such an amendment passed. Mainly would be the differences between the Democrats and the Republicans. Republicans initially were just against the spread of slavery, not the entire removal of it. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln urged his fellow Republicans that the complete removal of slavery was the just and right thing to do for the country. Most Democrats were fighting more to protect their individual states' rights and were concerned about giving Congress too much power. Although some Democrats also knew how heavily the region depended on the free labor that slavery afforded them and were worried about the effects on the economy. The second challenge was getting the amendment passed through the House and the Senate. In order to get an amendment passed through both, you need a 2/3 majority vote. The first stop for the amendment was a Republican-controlled Senate. And on April 8th, 1864, the amendment was passed by the Senate. So the next stop was the House. Unfortunately, the amendment initially died in the House as Democrats rallied in the name of states' rights. The election of 1864 brought Lincoln back to the White House, as well as a Republican majority in both the Senate and now in the House of Representatives. So on January 31st, 1865, the amendment passed 119 to 56, which is 7 votes more than the 2/3 majority needed. Now let's talk about what the amendment meant. The first part of the 13th Amendment essentially just ended slavery. But there was, however, a second part. The second part read, "Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." This part of the amendment is not nearly as talked about or known by people, but it's the first time that Congress was granted the power over decisions made on a state level. So, in closing, the 13th Amendment was arguably the most controversial and important amendment in U.S. history. While this amendment ended slavery, it did not tackle the issue of human rights. That would go on long after and bring forth 2 additional amendments. Still, this was the basis in the landmark amendment that made that future fight into human rights possible. So I've given you a brief history of the origins, challenges, and what the amendment meant to America. And I'd like to end with a quote from Abraham Lincoln that I believe explains what he thought this amendment meant. "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing, or all the other." Thank you.
4 minutes and